Hi, I'm Adam Summer. You're listening to the Yerushalmi Talk podcast with the support of the Yeshivat Devar Yerushalayim in Har Nof, Jerusalem. This is Sheviis, chapter 5, Halacha 3. Now, we have a law in the Torah that you're not allowed to put a stumbling block in front of a blind person. So what happens if you have a guy who, he might be a Sheviis merchant, but he needs some tools, and he asks you for tools? Well, you can't go and help somebody sin. You can't go and enable it. It's putting a stumbling block in front of a blind person. So if this guy has a tendency to want to go and do Sheviis merchant sales, and he has a bad character and he has an itch for it and he can't help it, this is how he wants to go and sin, well, you can't set him up to be able to go do that. So that's what we're going to talk about. We're going to be talking about a restriction on certain kinds of tools that could be used for doing things like plowing or pruning or things to enable you to break Sheviis. So the Mishnah says these are the farming implements that a craftsman is not permitted to sell during Sheviis. A plow and all its accessories. So a plow, it's not just the plow, but it's also the yoke, and it's all the things that connect the plow back to the yoke and the bit that the animal will bite onto. And it continues, it says a yoke. This is specifically talking about a harness that will go onto the plow, but it could also be used for like a wagon, right? Now, if you have a yoke that's just for a wagon, that's going to be allowed. We're worried about something that can be used to break Sheviis, and certainly just moving around with a wagon, there's no problem on Sheviis at all. So, if you have one that's specifically designed for a wagon, and the guy wants to borrow it, that's no problem. But we're talking about something that's specifically designed to go on with a plow. They're not the same thing. Now, very interesting that it's saying two things. First, it's saying a plow and its accessories. Then it's saying a yoke. So there's going to be a difference between the two, because accessories. It should seem obvious that a yoke would be in there, but it seems to separate it out. But perhaps this is talking about these like cutting tools within the plow, and these tools that are going to be used to attach it back to a yoke. Then you have a winnowing fork. A winnowing fork is going to be a tool that's specifically used to separate the wheat from the chaff at the threshing floor. So if somebody needs this, you're like, why are you borrowing this? This is only, or selling it. Why are you borrowing or selling this? This is really just for one thing. It means that you have a pile of wheat and you have a threshing floor that you're trying to process. So why are you doing this in Sheviis? Did you already go and harvest and plant, and now you can't get anything, you can't do anything without processing and winnowing it? So perhaps, this guy wouldn't have planted, and perhaps this guy wouldn't have harvested a crop on Sheviis if he knew that he had no access to a winnowing fork. And so you're not allowed to sell him a winnowing fork because, again, you're not allowed to enable him. But again, this guy might not have broken the law here, might not have broken Sheviis if he knew that there was no way for him to get a winnowing fork in the end, because he wouldn't be able to process the wheat or the barley. He wouldn't be able to make it marketable to sell on Sheviis. And then the final one is going to be a hoe, and this is going to be used to hoe and to get a field ready for plowing. So the idea is that these all are going to function where you could use it in a way that you could do prohibited labor on Sheviis, and that's why a craftsman can't go ahead and sell it to them. Again, in Leviticus 19:14, it says, "Before a blind man you shall not place a stumbling block." So the idea here, says the Rashi in Avodah Zarah 15b in Bavli, he's saying that we do not assume that the buyer is purchasing the tools to have it for the year following Sheviis, because farming tools are readily available for sale whenever they're needed. So there's no reason that a person should specifically want to buy that tool ahead of time. Why would you want to tie up your capital for an extra year? What are you doing? Why are you spending the money on that for an extra year? And it's not like the tools go out. I mean, people are making tools all the time, and certainly for harvest. And so, hey, like you could just wait the next year and have no problem getting these tools. So why do you need them right now? Why do you need them actually this year? Now, the Mishnah is going to continue. It's going to say, but he may sell a hand sickle, a reaping sickle, and a wagon and its accessories, because these articles are also permitted to use in Sheviis. So perhaps the buyer wants to go and use the sickle and a wagon to reap a small amount of produce from Hefker and bring it home and feed his family. He's allowed to do that. So we also see that, there could be vegetables that, could grow during the year. And so then why would you want a sickle? And, you're not allowed to do anything with a sefachim, but, perhaps there's going to be some crops that are going to be ready, that were planted in the sixth year and are ready in the seventh year, and you need to harvest them. So in any case, it wouldn't be sefachim, and it's going to be where the idea is that the sickle is going to be for reaping crops that are going to be permitted. And there's another idea about what about selling these tools to a non-Jew. Anyway, you have a biblical prohibition against placing a stumbling block in front of a blind person, and that's going to be where the object is certainly going to be used for sin, and it's not going to be something where it's questionable that it could be used for sin. So, if you have it where he could be doing a permitted activity, then, that's not a forbidden thing. But again, if you are selling a guy a plow and his tools, well, he could go buy a plow and his tools in the 8th year. He doesn't need to do that. But that's definitely just used for one thing. That's absolutely used for sitting. But in terms of a hand sickle, the guy's allowed to go to a field and collect hefker with it. So the Mishnah is going to sum this up, and it's going to say, this is the general rule. Any tool employed solely for its work, in other words, that's going to be work that's disallowed on Sheviis, is prohibited for sale. And if it is employed for both prohibited and permitted work, it is permitted for sale. So the idea here is that this is a little bit different than the laws that we had for trees and for tending trees that we had earlier in chapter 1. Earlier in chapter 1, we saw that if we have work that's going to go on a tree and it's going to do two things. One is it's going to save the tree from some problem like, say, bugs. But this application you have, in this case it was wet mud, would do something where it stimulates growth, and you have two things occurring. One is going to be where, you're allowed to go and process a tree in a way that totally saves it, But what's prohibited is going to be where it has some kind of thing that promotes growth during the year. You're not allowed to do it. So you have to find a way to do it where you're doing a technique that does not have any way of promoting growth. Now, this is a little bit similar because it's saying like, okay, well, if you have a tool and this tool is going to be in between where it could be used for work, and it's also going to be where you could also be doing it for permitted work. In this case, it's going to be allowed for sale. Why would that be? Because this is a tool, and this is going to be somewhat removed from actually processing a tree itself. Actually processing the tree itself is going to be something that's very direct, and this is going to be on something that is not direct. Perhaps the guy is actually following the law. So the Mishnah is going to continue with other kinds of restrictions on Sheviis that are going to have problems because they can have an association with breaking Sheviis. So it continues and it says, a potter may sell up to 5 jugs of oil and 15 jugs of wine, since this is what can reasonably expected to be brought home from ownerless property. So the idea here is that fields have to be kept open and you have to give access to everybody. And it's unlikely that any single person will manage to harvest more than a certain amount just for himself. In other words, he's harvesting this for himself. He's getting enough olives for himself from this Hefker property, and he's getting enough grapes for himself from the Hefker property. Again, these olive trees are there. Some of these olive trees will live for hundreds of years, and it's there. So the Torah says on Sheviis, you can go out and you can go collect the olives on the 7th year. They're Hefker. They don't belong to the owner anymore. You go into his field and go collect it. What are you using the olives for? What are you using the wine for? Well, you're going to be able to make for Kiddush and light your Shabbos candles. And so the guy has a certain amount of time to go collect this stuff, and he has some competition. And so the sages are saying what's reasonable to be able to do. Now, if a potter comes and gets a huge order, it says from a single guy with 1,000 jugs of oil instead of 5 jugs of oil, well, it's clear that the guy is probably, prohibiting people from going to his orchard and collecting olives. Maybe he's locked the gate. And perhaps what he's doing is he's collecting all of the yield for himself to be a Sheviis merchant. So again, you're not allowed to put a stumbling block in front of a blind person. And so the sages are saying that it's limited to what somebody can reasonably collect from their own produce. Also, you're not allowed to close up from the public. And so the idea here is that this is the amount of grapes that you could come and collect and make probably 15 jugs of wine is probably a lot. It's probably going to correspond, if somebody were to calculate it out, for Shabbats and Yom Tovs and Rosh Chodeshes and things like that. So it's probably going to be around a year's supply for use. That's my guess, although I don't know for sure, but I suspect it's probably going to be a year's use for a person. The Mishnah is going to continue. It's going to say, but if a customer brought home more than this amount, and now he wishes to purchase more than the number of jugs we talked about, it is permissible to sell him the number he requests, because we do not, after the fact, suspect that he brought the produce for an illegally restricted field. So what's going on here? The Mara Fulda is saying that this is a case where he brought home more olives or grapes than is allowed to sell him more than 5 jugs or 15 jugs of wine. And the Chazan Ish is explaining that if the person brought home more than this amount of olives and grapes, the potter is still allowed to sell him 5 oil jugs and 15 wine jugs, despite the fact that someone who brings home so much oil or wine is suspected of having picked it from a protected field. In other words, that what's a protected field? This is going to be where somebody came and set it up so nobody else can come and enter it to go and collect it. He's effectively seized the whole field from himself and locked out all the other poor people. Or it's the owner who's basically saying that, no, I actually own this. I'm not listening to the Torah. And this is not hefker. This is not free for everybody. This is not a case where I have, these ownerless trees, so to speak, where, I don't have the ownership of what it produces, and I'm going to seize it. And so the idea here is that Chazan Ish is saying that they're going to restrict based on the suspicion to that excess. In other words, they're going to suspect that he's picking from a protected field, and although the excess is going to be suspect, one may not sell him jugs for it. And the idea is, says the Chazan Ish, that we still assume that the initial 5 or 15 jugs worth to have been legally acquired, and then one is permitted to sell him jugs for that amount. So that's a different interpretation from what the Marafulda is saying. And the Mishnah is going to continue with a new law. It's going to say, and the potter may sell to an idol worshiper within the land of Israel and to a Jew outside of the land. Why? Because outside of the land, that doesn't have halachic, deraita, Sheviis sanctity. So also, an idol worshiper doing something with his grapes in the land, perhaps a Kuthian or something like that, and they're growing grapes up there or something like that. Maybe don't use a Kuthian idea, because at some point I think you could take their wine. But let's take a Canaanite, right? So, there's a Canaanite here, and could you go and, sell him pots so that he has more than 15, jugs of wine? Sure, because he's not subject to the laws of Sheviis. It's for a Jew in the land. And what about a Jew outside the land? Well, it's not a deraita thing for, outside of the land. And there's going to be more on this topic when you get into the dispute between Bet Shammai and Bet Hillel. Bet Shammai says one may not sell him a plowing cow during Sheviis because he will plow with it. And Bet Hillel permits it since the buyer can slaughter it. So the worry here is that, why are you selling this plowing cow? This kind of cow has been trained to plow. It's used to wearing a yoke and walking, and knows how to do the furrows, knows how to walk so that the plow goes into the earth. It's been trained. It's a trained cow. Why are you selling him a plowing cow during Sheviis? Why do you need a plowing cow during Sheviis? So Bet Shammai says no. Bet Hillel says, well, he can slaughter and eat it. So the idea is that, it is possible that the buyer is going to, want to slaughter it, but it's unlikely. But the seller may assume that this is the buyer's intention, according to Bet Hillel. Now, if you definitely knew that it was going to be for plowing, then even Bet Hillel would agree that you're not allowed to sell this. So in the case of the 4 tools that are mentioned here in the beginning of the Mishnah, even Bet Hillel is going to agree that the sale is forbidden, because there's no other objective for why this person is buying these tools on Sheviis. So the idea here is that on this cow could be used still to slaughter. So Bet Shammai says that this cow should be put into the category of, a hoe, a yoke, a winnowing fork, and a plow. And Bet Hillel says, no, it's more like the case of the sickle, where you could still do permitted work with it. And in the case of this permitted thing, it would be slaughtering and eating it. The Mishnah continues and says, one may sell him produce even during the planting season. Now, this is going to be, says the Rosh, that one may not assume that he plans on planting the produce, since he might want it for eating. And even Bet Shammai, who forbids selling a plowing cow, agrees in this case, since there's no hard evidence as to the person's illegal intent. And the Mishnah is going to continue. It's going to say, and one may lend him his seah measure, even though he knows it is for the threshing floor. And what does that mean? The Rosh says, one may lend a Sheviis violator a seah measure without being concerned that he intends to use it to measure his Sheviis produce for storage, which is not allowed, since Sheviis produce must be eaten and not stockpiled for the future. So we assume that he needs this measure, these like weights and measures, for his own grinding, which he's allowed to do. So the Mishnah is going to continue. It's going to say one may change for him maos into perutos, even though he knows he has workers. What is that? This is going to be where you're changing a larger size coin, denomination coin, into smaller denomination coins. And the idea is that perhaps this violator has workers, and perhaps this guy's doing work on the land and he has to pay his workers for this illegal work. And perhaps the idea here, says the Rosh, Cirilio, is that we actually may assume that he needs the change for some other permitted purpose, or for his workers that are doing tasks that are actually allowed. Again, this theme is coming in where what if you have, activity that could both be permitted and both be prohibited. And the idea is that if you can find permitted aspects within this, then it's allowed. But if it's going to be only prohibited and there's no redeeming aspect to it, there's nothing permitted that could be allowed in it, then you're not allowed to do it. So in this case of changing coins so that the guy can pay workers, perhaps he has his workers, yeah, but perhaps they're doing permitted things. So that's going to be a case where it's going to be allowed. But again, if you had a case where somebody comes over to you and says, can I borrow your plow and all the tools that, would go onto an oxen, you're not allowed to do it because that could only be used for one thing. Same with a winnowing fork. You're only doing one thing with it. And the Mishnah finishes up and says, and all of these sales or loans are forbidden if the buyer states explicitly that he wants the item for illegal activity. So if he's made it known that, yeah, this item, could be used for a prohibited thing and a permitted thing, and he makes it known that he's going to be using it for a prohibited thing and not the permitted thing, well, you're not allowed to do it. So if he comes along and says, oh, geez, I take that back where I said, geez, that's it's slang, but it's not appropriate because it's connected to American style of Avodah Zarah. So I slipped, but anyway, the guy comes along to you and says, wow, I got this plow, it's Sheviis, and my cow died. And I got this crop growing. Can you lend me your plowing cow? Well, everybody would agree you can't go lend it to him because what's he going to do with it? He's going to go plow his Sheviis produce, and he's a Sheviis merchant, or he's going to plow the field so he can sow, so he can make Sheviis produce, right? So the idea here is that this is not a case where the guy's going to go buy it and slaughter it for eating. He's gonna take it and do illegal work with it. So everybody agrees that if the buyer is stating explicitly that he wants to break Sheviis, you're not allowed to do it. Gemara is going to say about these implements, these tools that you're not allowed to sell during Sheviis, and the Gemara is going to elaborate on it. And Rabbi Yonah says, thus, the Mishnah is to be understood that these are the tools that a craftsman is not permitted to sell during Sheviis to one who is suspect regarding Sheviis. In other words, if you have a person who's known to be observant of the laws of Sheviis, perhaps he's a Torah scholar or he's a chaver, then he is permitted to sell these items to, say, a Torah scholar because we assume that he's buying them to use after Sheviis. So the Rambam commentary here in the Mishnah is saying that there is no reason for anyone to buy farming tools for the coming year because they're always available for purchase when they're needed. And the fact that the customer is observant of Sheviis is going to allow us to assume that he's buying these tools for the next year. So a Torah scholar comes, he knows the laws, he's a chaver, he follows everything, and he wants to buy these forbidden tools, well, are you allowed to sell it to him? You are, because he's doing it for some other purpose. He's not doing it to go break Sheviis, because he knows about it. He knows the consequences of breaking Sheviis. That's the idea. The Gemara is going to ask, and it's going to say, what is the law regarding a person whose level of Sheviis observance is unknown? In other words, perhaps you have a guy here, and you don't know whether he's going to observe Sheviis or if he's going to be a Sheviis violator. You don't know either way. In other words, the question is going to be, can you sell these tools or not? The Gemara is going to answer, and it's going to say, from that which the Mishnah teaches, if the tool is employed for both prohibited and permitted work, it is permissible to be sold, because we may assume the buyer intends to use it in a permitted way. And it may be concluded that selling to a person whose level of observance is unknown is permissible. So the idea here is that if you're selling a tool that could be used both for a permitted and a forbidden use to a known Sheviis violator, we are possibly helping him sin. But nevertheless, the sale is permitted, because we can assume that he is purchasing the item for a permitted use. Maybe he made tshuva. Similarly, we can conclude that it is allowed to sell an implement having only a forbidden use to one whose level of Sheviis observance is unknown, because we can assume that he is a Sheviis observer and he's purchasing the tool for after use in Sheviis. Now, the Mishnah is going to continue, and the potter may sell up to 5 jugs of oil and 15 jugs of wine. And the Gemara is going to ask about this, but be concerned that perhaps the buyer lied when he requested 15 jugs for wine, and he will switch the use for oil. So in other words, you have a case where the Mishnah says 5 and 15. 5 for oil, 15 for wine. And the idea is, well, perhaps the guy doesn't have any access at all to grapes. Perhaps he only has access to a field of trees that are going to be olive trees. And he says, okay, give me 5 and give me 15. Well, it's going to be 20. And he's actually going to go switch the use, because now, he's going to keep 5 for himself for the year of olive oil. He has no access to grapes anyway. There's no grapes around. So he's going to take this and get extra olive oil, and he could sell that. So the question here is that maybe the guy's lying, and he's actually going to switch the use for olive oil. And the Gemara is going to answer, and it's going to say, Rabbi Yonah said the jugs of each type are recognizable, and which ones are going to be for wine and which ones are going to be for oil. In other words, they have a different shape, and this different shape on the potter's jug is going to help that type of usage. So that's going to be a case. So in other words, if the potter comes in and says, the guy comes into the potter and says, oh, give me, just 20. Well, he wouldn't do that, because he knows it's 5 and 15. And if you say, well, maybe the guy's cheating, and he's going to take these, these 15 and use them over here for this other 5. Well, first of all, everybody's going to know he's a Sheviis merchant, because he's using the wrong thing, the wrong pot for the wrong thing. So let's say you have extra grapes and you're going to make it into wine, and you only have access to grapes. You have no access to the wine. And then you'd say, well, why is this wine in a jug for oil? Or vice versa. You would say, why is this olive oil in wine jugs? And, they've seen in the archaeology and sunken ships that the wine jugs were very, very long and very tapered at the bottom. And that's not suitable for oil. The oil jugs are much more rounded. And there's going to be another answer. Rabbi Ula says that the leather of these is recognizable and the leather of these is recognizable. So the word leather here is used in a borrowed sense, saying that, says the Rosh about this, that since the jugs are made out of clay, not leather, Rabbi Ula means that The clay from which each of the two jugs is made has its own distinct appearance, and if the buyer were to place his oil or wine in the opposite type of clay, the contents would spoil. That's going to be the idea here. And this is also reiterated by the Beur Hagra. The Vilna Goan is saying that if you put the wrong kind in the wrong kind of jug, you're going to ruin the contents, they spoil. So there's a self-defense mechanism in here so that you don't get any cheating. So the Mishnah says that a potter may sell to non-Jews in the land of Israel, and the Gemara is going to explain about that. And it says that he may sell them even more jugs than this, even more than, say 5 oil jugs and 15 wine jugs. That says in the Mishnah. Why? Because a non-Jew within Eretz Yisrael or a Jew outside of Eretz Yisrael is not going to be dealing with the laws of Sheviis. So, in the case of a non-Jew within Eretz Yisrael, the question is going to be that, well, maybe the seller or maybe the buyer of these jugs will go to and resell to a Jew who is going to be a Sheviis merchant who's going to look for these extra jugs. So the Gemara is going to say, and he may sell even more jugs than this, and the Mishnah says, and to a Jew outside of the land, and the Gemara explains that he may even sell from a stock of jugs purchased within the land. And the idea, says the Marafulda, is that we're not worried that he will return such jugs to Eretz Yisrael and then sell them there for Sheviis merchants who are going to go try to, store up oil and wine gathered in non-Hefker fields. And, there's a worry perhaps that, well, maybe these people are going to come and return the jugs to Eretz Yisrael and, come and, do business in Eretz Yisrael to sell to Sheviis merchants. But again, we have to assume that, well, there's no Sheviis outside of the land for a Jew, and maybe he's actually buying the pottery to have olive oil and wine, Chutz La'aretz, outside of Israel, in which case there's no problem, and that's going to be a permitted use. And again, we get back into this, well, it could be prohibited, it could be permitted, but we have to err on the side that he's using it for the permitted thing. Now, the Mishnah is going to move on and talk about Bet Shammai, and he's talking about the plowing cow during Sheviis, and Bet Hillel is going to permit this because, well, he can go and buy the cow and eat it. He's allowed to slaughter the cow. He's not necessarily going to use it for plowing. And again, it's this case that, this cow has this dual use. It could be prohibited, where it's just going to be used for plowing, but Bet Hillel finds a way where it says, no, but it also could be permitted use. You can eat it. So the Gemara is going to talk about a dispute between the Amorim here, and it's going to say it was taught if one sells an ox to his fellow and it is found to be a gorer, and this is going to be an ox that's very nasty in its temperament, and it uses its horns to go and to stick the horns into other cows or into people, God forbid, then you're allowed to take a cow whose nature, or ox whose nature is going to be very aggressive and use his horns in a violent way and to attack other cows and other people's property and other people. And you're allowed to slaughter and eat it. Even in a normal year, you're allowed to slaughter and eat it because it really is a liability. You can get yourself into a lot of trouble by owning one of these kinds of cows. And let's say you have a cow that has this temperament and it just developed this temperament and it was already trained for plowing. Well, the idea is that normally you go sell it for slaughter and you get some value out of it. And the problem with keeping a cow like this, especially when you know that the nature is going to be where it gores, is when it does damage, because it's part of its nature is to do this kind of activity, and you know about it, you are liable. And so if it kills somebody, you have an issue. And these can be very dangerous. So what happens if you have the 7th year and you actually own a cow now that is a proven gorer? What, you wouldn't be able to sell it for meat? Is that going to be the issue? So the Gemara is going to continue, and Rav says that this is considered a purchase made in error, and the seller must refund the buyer's money. And Shmuel, however, says that the seller can say to the buyer, I sold it to you for slaughtering. And that's going to be that, yeah, this has a violent nature, and it's not going to be nullifying the sale. In other words, what case are we dealing with here, okay? That's what's going to be asked in the Gemara coming up. But let's say you have a guy who goes and sells the ox to the gorer. Rav is saying that this is being done in a case where, most ox are going to be used for plowing. And, we have an idea that we follow the majority. And that's going to be that, the purchase would also be used for plowing, since that's what the majority of these oxen are used for. And so if it turns out that, that the owner, doesn't know that this has a violent nature, or perhaps, or perhaps he does know it has a violent nature and he's selling it, and the guy who buys it, is effectively buying it in error and saying, well, I was using it for plowing. I didn't know I had to go slaughter it. Well, the idea is, well, would that be a transaction, right? Or not? And if that were to be the case where you knew you had a Goan cow and you sold it, and it's a plowing cow, right? Or a plowing ox. And the guy buys it and he's a Sheviis merchant. He's going to come and he's gonna use it for plowing, but he can't use a violent animal for plowing. It's going to damage the other cows. It might damage him. And he says, "Oh, it's an error, and give me my money back." And the idea here that Shmuel is saying is that, yeah, okay, some oxen are going to do that. It's a minority, but the seller can argue that this sale was made to slaughter it, because you can't plow with a violent ox. It's too dangerous, and there's a liability. So would that sale be nullified or not? So the Gemara is going to talk about the circumstance of this case, and what are we dealing with? And the Gemara says it is a case where the seller sold it to a sharecropper who usually buys an ox to plow the landlord's fields, and all agree that he sold it for plowing, and thus even Shmuel would admit that the sale is nullified. And if it is where he sold it to a butcher who buys animals for slaughtering, everybody agrees that he sold it for slaughtering. And even Rav would admit that the sale is going to be valid, because he didn't sell it to a sharecropper, he sold it to a butcher. Butcher would never use the cow for plowing. He's only going to use it for meat, because that's what he sells. So the Gemara here says that we are dealing with the following case, where he sold it to a middleman who's going to buy the ox to resell to other kinds of people. That would be both to either a sharecropper or a butcher. And, there's that this is what they're saying that this Gemara is talking about, where it's, because it's kind of unclear who the buyer's identity would be, as to why this guy's complaining that, this is he bought a plowing ox, and it turns out to be a gorer. Why would there be a problem on it? And Rav is saying, says this Gemara, it is considered a purchase made in error, since most of the oxen will be used for plowing. This is, again, selling it to a middleman who's going to go either resell it to a butcher or go resell it to a sharecropper. So Shmuel says that the seller can say to the buyer, I sold it to you for slaughtering. In other words, I didn't sell it to you to go resell it to a Sheviis merchant. I sold it to you because, you're allowed to sell an ox that's known to be a gorer, and you're allowed to sell it for the value of meat. There's no problem with that. So, perhaps it seems that the value of a plowing ox that's live is worth more than a dead ox that's been butchered. So it would seem that this middleman has taken a loss. But the point is that, well, the majority of the times he's going to want to sell it to the sharecropper, because the sharecropper will pay a higher price for this live cow that's been trained to go and plow the furrows. He knows how to do it. The ox knows how to do it. So that's a more valuable sale than just selling it to a butcher who's going to go kill it and sell it for meat. So in that case, the middleman is coming along, and perhaps he's going to be, enabling a sharecropper who would be violating Sheviis. And, because he doesn't want to sell it for meat. He wants to get the high price. He himself might be a merchant who, doesn't mind selling the cow to a guy who's going to be known as a Sheviis violator. And he's complaining, and he's saying, but you sold me the wrong thing. And Shmuel's saying, no, you can go settle it. You can go and sell it for meat for this lower price. So the Gemara is going to ask, the opinion of Rav, as stated here, is reversed from his opinion elsewhere, and the opinion of Shmuel is reversed from his opinion from elsewhere. And they argued elsewhere that if one sold his ancestral field to a buyer in the Yovel year itself, in other words, this is going to be where, the Torah says that the ancestral land from one of the tribal divisions that, you inherit in perpetuity, goes on forever, that, it's going to go back to the seller during the Yovel year. So the Gemara here is presenting a debate as to what is the law if somebody sells his field in the Yovel year itself. What's going to happen? Is it going to go back in the Yovel year to him, or does he have to wait another 50 years? So Rav says that the buyer has acquired the field, the sale takes effect momentarily, but it returns back to his possession in the Yovel. That's going to be immediately. In other words, that the sale happens. It has a transaction that goes through. It's a sale that works, but since it's the Yovel causes it to return, and so the sale just lasts for a millisecond, a halachic. It just, it's just a second, and since the sale took effect for even a second, the money still belongs to the seller, so it's still a transaction. And Shmuel says he has not acquired the field at all, and the sale of the field in the Yovel year does not take effect at all. In other words, Bnei Moshe says about this that this is a purchase that's made in error, because the buyer did not intend to spend the money on a field that he would not retain at all. And in that case, he has to return the money to the buyer. So if it were sold in the Yovel year, he would not wait another 50 years. That basically, according to Shmuel, it's not a transaction at all, and he has to return the money. According to Rav, it's saying that the sale takes effect even just for a second, and he gets to keep the money. So the Gemara is going to talk about this contradiction. The opinion of Rav is reversed, and there we say in the case of the Yovel that Rav says that he has acquired the field for an instant, even though most of the people would not buy a field for just a second. Yet here, with respect to the ox that was found to be a gorer, Rav says that he has not acquired the ox because most people would not buy a goring ox because they want it for plowing. And this is going to be a purchase that's made in error. Now, the Gemara is going to come up and fix this contradiction. And the Gemara is going to say there, in the case of the Yovel, the fact that this year is Yovel is well known, and the buyer cannot claim that he's unaware of the fact. Everybody knows it's the Yovel. They blow trumpets and everything. So he cannot claim that this is a purchase made in error. So, yeah, even though the majority of the people would not go and purchase a field that would revert back to the seller the very next second, this person is obviously, in the minority, but he knew that it's going to be a Yovel. And you know what the Yovel is. It's a known fact. So he still entered into this transaction. And why would that be? Well, perhaps he's really just trying to give the money as a gift. And he knows that, it can't be returned because it's a transaction that went through. So this is a way to use halacha, according to Rav, to actually just make a gift to somebody that can't be returned. That's the idea. So the Gemara is going to talk about this second opinion. Well, the first opinion is going to be that, well, the yovel is well known, but the nature of this goring ox is not well known. And so because the nature of this goring ox is not well known, it's a transaction made in error. The Gemara now is going to talk about the second opinion, and says the opinion of Shmuel is reversed. From there, in the case of the yovel, Shmuel says that he has not acquired the field at all. In other words, the sale does not take effect because most people would not buy a field just for a second. So a transaction that's made in error is not a transaction at all. You have to give the money back. Yet here, with respect to the ox that's found out to be the gorer, Shmuel is saying that he's acquired the ox, and even though most people would not buy a wild goring ox, in other words, they want the ox to be a plowing ox. They don't want it to sell for meat because it's lower value. Perhaps he played for plowing ox, which is higher value, and he finds out it's a goring ox, and the sale of a goring ox is worth much, much less for meat, and he wants his money back. It's made in error. He didn't know about the nature. Gemara is going to resolve this contradiction. It's going to say, for what purpose did he sell him the field in the yovel? Was it not for sowing? Since the buyer will never be able to sow the field, it is clear that the purchase was made in error. But here, the ox was found to be a gorer, and the seller can say to the buyer, I sold it to you for slaughtering. In other words, the minority of the people do not buy an ox to go slaughter it. They want to go buy it to plow the field. And so he can say, the seller can argue, that this sale was made for that purpose. So the Gemara is going to ask, and it's going to say, shall we say that Rav follows Bet Shammai in the Mishnah and Shmuel follows Bet Hillel? In other words, Rav is ruling that in the case of the sale of the ox that turns out to be the gorer, that the sale does not take effect because he can't claim that the ox was going to be being bought for slaughtering. He's admitting that this is going to be used for plowing. And Bet Shammai in this Mishnah is saying that you cannot sell a plowing cow during Sheviis, and you can't just come and claim that this cow is being bought for slaughtering, because he's complaining and saying, no, I bought it for plowing on the Sheviis, and I didn't buy it for meat. Shmuel here is saying that there is no sale because you can assume that a cow that was bought for slaughtering coincides with the view of Bet Hillel that you can use the plowing cow during Sheviis, because you can assume that you're buying a plowing cow in Sheviis to slaughter it. So a person who goes and buys an animal, says the Vilna Goan, for slaughtering does not necessarily slaughter on that day. He might keep it alive for a month and slaughter it after. So the Gemara is going to say that on the surface it does not seem to say that Rav holds like Bet Shammai, and on the examination it can be found that even hold like Bet Hillel, for when he buys the ox for slaughtering, it is not the usual way for him to keep it alive for up to 30 days and then slaughter it sometime after. In other words, that he might not come and bring it to the butcher right away. He might wait 30 days. The Gemara says that if the ox is wild during those 30 days, it can cause damage. So then is it not a purchase made in error? So Rav might agree that, yeah, like what Bet Hillel says, yeah, you can sell a plowing cow to a suspected Sheviis violator, and you can assume that the buyer is going to slaughter it. But Rav is still saying that if an ox is sold and then discovered to be a goring ox, it is still a purchase made in error, because no one, even a person who buys an ox for slaughter, wants to buy a wild ox because of the liability. He does not want to sit and hold it for several weeks before he slaughters it, because it can go damage his other oxen, or it can even gore him, because it has a very aggressive nature. And the Gemara is going to continue to answer. It says, and while on the surface it does not seem, as you say, that Shmuel follows Bet Hillel, upon examination, it is found that he can even hold like Bet Shammai, For it is not the way of a person to slaughter a plowing ox. So Bet Shammai is stating that, the Mishnah is saying that one cannot sell, even during Sheviis, a plowing cow or plowing ox because it's been trained for plowing. And Shmuel might agree that not even a minority of the people would go slaughter such a valuable cow. So the buyer of this cow would surely use it to go plow for Sheviis. It's too valuable to go sell for meat. So the idea here, says Bet Shammai, is that you're not allowed to sell it to him because it's so valuable that you're not going to just go sell it for meat. You're gonna use it to violate it because you need to use it now. You're not paying for it next year. You're paying it for this year. And so why are you paying for such an expensive cow this year? If you need it for plowing, why not just buy it next year when you actually need it for plowing? It'll be a year younger, or you get another cow that's a year younger. So in this case of this dispute between Shmuel and Rav, this is going to be where the cow is not known to have been trained to plow, and it turns out that it was actually just a case where it turned out to be wild, and they're trying to get it to plow, and you see it has a wild nature to it. So Bet Shammai might agree with Shmuel that the buyer is not entitled to a refund because the seller can claim that the buyer is from the minority of people who purchased this ox for meat, not for plowing. So the Mishnah says that he may lend him a seah measure, even for the threshing floor. This is going to finish up the rest of the Gemara. And the Gemara elaborates on it. It says, Rabbi Acha says in the name of Rabbi Tanchum Bar Chia, who says in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, if he lent him his seah measure, assuming that he would use it in a permitted manner, and subsequently he came and found him measuring produce for storage with it, which is a forbidden thing, he is not obligated to retrieve it from him. And all the more so, he need not retrieve it in a case where he rented him the seah measure. What's this saying? So this is saying that we're assuming that he needs to measure his produce for grinding. He's allowed to do that. You come along and you see that he's not using it for grinding. He's using it to store the produce and measure it out. He's taking, all the leeks, for example, the loof, and he's bundling them together and he's measuring them. He's saying each one weighs a kilo, and he's making them in nice packages together. Okay, each one exactly a kilo. That's going to be a sign where he's using it he's going to be getting it ready for sale. He's not getting it ready for his own use. Why do you need to have a seah measure for getting ready to sell, produce? But if it's going to be ready where, you're going to grind out bags of wheat and you're going to store it in certain bags and you're measuring it out so that that the bag can only hold a certain amount, you're allowed to do that. There are bags, they don't hold infinite weight. That certain bags will hold a certain amount of weight, and you're allowed to measure it out. So the question here is going to be, well, you've lent it out, and now you see him actually, violating it. What do you do? So, you would have thought that since the lender was the cause of the sin, he'd be able to undo the act by just taking back the measure. Rabbi Yochanan says the Chazan Ish is teaching us that this is not the case. Rather, since at the time he lent him the measure, he was permitted to do so, it is not considered a stumbling block that came about through him. And you're still required, says the Chazan Ish, to rebuke the sinner, just as he sees any other Jew sinning is required to do. But you don't actually have to come and seize the lent tools. You are not the cause of a sin. So there's some very important things that, coming out here. And, tomorrow in Halacha 4, we're going to talk about loaning animals and farming tools to people who are suspected of, maybe violating Sheviis. So it's going to be more about that. Have a great day.